My stepmother claimed I was the love of his life. But when I uncovered my dad's private journal, the real story about their marriage shocked everyone. I didn't expect that one cold afternoon of cleaning out dad's things would turn into the most disturbing week of my life. I hadn't been back to the house since his funeral. It was a modest two-story just outside Pittsburgh, the house he'd shared with my mother before she died, and the one he kept with Eleanor, my stepmother, when they married. And now it was empty, except for me and the haunting silence. Eleanor had been pressing me to come over and help her, but I knew what that meant. She'd sit back with her gin and tonic, sighing dramatically as I packed up dad's belongings and kept her company. But when she called me for the third time, her voice quivering with something almost like real grief, I finally gave in. "Taylor, it's just been so hard," she said over the phone, sighing heavily. "You know, I don't think I can bear to go through his things alone." "Yeah, Eleanor." "Sure," I replied, not entirely hiding my reluctance. "You know, I really was the love of his life," she added, almost as an afterthought. Her words made my stomach twist. "Oh? I didn't realize he'd shared that with you," I muttered, unable to hide the sarcasm. But she didn't seem to notice. "Well, of course he did. He told me things you'll never know," she said, her voice soft and dramatic. "Things only the two of us would understand." I rolled my eyes and agreed to meet her the following day. That's how I ended up alone in his old study, Eleanor's footsteps receding as she wandered to the kitchen to make her third drink. I'd been dreading this. The smell of his aftershave still lingered on his coat draped over the chair, and a half-finished crossword sat on the desk, mocking me with the illusion of life. I was sorting through his desk drawers when I found it, a dusty, leather-bound journal shoved at the back. It was the sort of thing he'd never mentioned to me, and curiosity got the better of me. I carefully pulled it out and opened the first page. There, in Dad's unmistakable handwriting, was the date, August 14, 2009. Right around the time he'd started seeing Eleanor. The first few lines took me aback. They were raw, uncertain, vulnerable in a way I'd never associated with him. August 14, 2009, is it love or am I just afraid of being alone? Eleanor is unlike anyone I've ever known, and maybe that's the draw. I don't know if I see her as a partner, but she brings something to my life that wasn't there before. Even if I don't quite understand it. I sat down heavily on his old office chair, heart pounding as I took in the words. My dad, afraid of being alone? I'd only ever known him as steady and content, someone who seemed entirely comfortable in his own company. But as I kept reading, I felt my understanding of him begin to unravel. October 2, 2009, Eleanor makes me feel young, in a way. She brings me to places I'd never go on my own, introduces me to people I'd never meet. But sometimes, I feel like an accessory, as if she's taking me along for show. It's as if I'm a character in her story, and I'm not sure I belong there. Taylor. Eleanor's voice jolted me back to the present. Are you going to be much longer up there? I cleared my throat, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. Just a few more boxes to go through. Well, don't be all day. There's hardly anything up there worth keeping, she called back, clearly more focused on the bar than the memory of my father. My chest tightened with a mixture of anger and grief. I turned back to the journal, drawn deeper into his inner world. As the months went on, his entries shifted. He still talked about his doubts and insecurities, but there was something else, a sense of disillusionment that he couldn't quite put into words. March 15, 2010, sometimes I think Eleanor loves the idea of me more than the real me. She's always calling me her perfect man, but I don't feel perfect at all. In fact, I feel like I'm falling short of what she expects. I'm not the romantic she wants me to be, and I don't think I'll ever be. The words cut into me. All those times Eleanor had praised Dad in front of her friends, calling him the love of her life, and he'd just nod along, his eyes far away. I'd always thought it was because he was modest. But maybe he'd been holding back something deeper. I heard footsteps on the stairs and quickly shut the journal, sliding it back into the drawer just as Eleanor poked her head into the study. Find anything interesting? She asked, her eyes glinting with that familiar curiosity that always seemed to have an edge to it. Just some old paperwork, I said, shrugging nonchalantly. Tax forms, things like that. Oh. She didn't seem too disappointed, but her gaze lingered on the desk. Well, don't go poking around too much. Some things are better left undisturbed, don't you think? I forced a smile, feeling the weight of her words. Did she know about the journal? Did she know what he'd written? Later that night, after Eleanor had gone to bed, I retrieved the journal and continued reading. Each entry peeled back another layer of the man I thought I knew. There was one passage, dated 2 years after they'd married, that shook me. January 23, 2013, Eleanor told me tonight that she needs more from me. She wants me to be more vocal, more expressive. I'm trying, but sometimes I think she wants a different man. She tells her friends that I'm her perfect husband, and I wonder if she's created a version of me that only exists in her mind. A bitter laugh escaped me. So it hadn't just been me feeling this way. Dad had been living under the shadow of her expectations, too. The next morning, I confronted Eleanor. She was sitting at the kitchen counter, sipping her coffee like nothing was wrong. I found Dad's journal, I blurted out. She froze, her eyes widening for just a fraction of a second before she composed herself. Oh? And? He wrote some things. Things that make me wonder about your marriage. I kept my voice even, but I could feel my pulse racing. She set down her cup, folding her hands neatly in her lap. Taylor, your father was a complicated man. He was also unhappy, I said, unable to stop myself. He wrote about feeling like he didn't know where he fit in your life. Like he was playing a part for you. Eleanor's expression hardened. Do you have any idea what your father went through with me? I was the one who was always there for him. The one who supported him through everything. He was the love of my life. Funny, I shot back, the anger finally breaking through. Because he wrote that he felt like a placeholder. He wondered if you were using him for some, I don't know, idea you had in your head. Eleanor's jaw clenched, and for a moment, I saw something in her eyes, an emotion that was too raw, too real for her to hide. You wouldn't understand, she whispered, almost to herself. Maybe not, I replied. But he deserved better than being a part in someone else's play. She looked at me, and for the first time, she seemed truly vulnerable. Taylor. You have no idea what it's like to live in fear that you're going to be alone forever. I needed him. Maybe he needed me, too, but yes, maybe it wasn't perfect. But we had something, even if it wasn't what you'd call love. I stared at her, feeling the anger dissolve into something else. A strange sympathy, maybe. Or just the realization that we were both mourning a man we'd never fully understood. After that, we packed up the rest of his things in silence. I took the journal with me, not as a way to remember Eleanor's betrayal, but as a reminder of the man my father truly was. He'd stayed true to himself in the only way he knew how, even in the pages of a secret journal he never intended for anyone to read. In the end, the truth didn't bring the peace I'd hoped for, but it brought me closer to him, in a way. I'd come to terms with his flaws, his fears, his doubts, and maybe even learned a little bit about my own in the process. The next time I saw Eleanor was at a family gathering. She was there, dressed in her usual glamorous style, and when she looked at me, we shared a nod, a silent acknowledgement of the truth we'd both uncovered and the secrets we'd now carry forever. I left Eleanor at that family gathering with the journal tucked away in my bag, the weight of my father's hidden thoughts pressing against me like an unsolved riddle. It felt like he'd left me a puzzle that didn't fully make sense, and now that I knew the truth about their so-called love story, I couldn't let it go. The longer I thought about it, the more I realized that Eleanor's version of their life wasn't just some exaggerated story. It was a lie she had clung to with fierce determination, shaping everyone's perception of their relationship. And for her, it was perfect, so long as it stayed that way. The following days were tense. Eleanor called me multiple times, trying to gauge whether I'd share Dad's journal with anyone else. Her voice always had an edge to it, a mix of nervousness and that old charm she used to lure people in. But I wasn't playing her game anymore. Then, just as I was stewing over the next steps, I received an email from Dad's attorney. Eleanor hadn't mentioned any details about the estate since the funeral, and now I knew why. The email included information that hadn't come up before, likely something Eleanor had hoped would never come to light. Dad had set up a trust, one that he'd only mentioned briefly to me once, but I'd brushed off, thinking it wasn't important. But as I read on, the details shocked me. The trust, in fact, was mostly designated for me. Not Eleanor. Dad had protected his assets in such a way that Eleanor only received the house, while all other assets and investments, his savings, stocks, and retirement fund, were meant to be split, with the majority going to me. I remembered that conversation we'd had about trusts and inheritance, years ago over coffee. I'd assumed he was just being cautious. I never thought he'd really prepare for this. Fueled by anger and a need to settle the score, I decided to confront Eleanor one last time. I drove to the house and let myself in without knocking, something she absolutely hated. She was in the living room, on the phone with a friend, doing her usual song and dance about how much she missed Dad. "Oh, Donna," she was saying dramatically, "you know I was his everything. He couldn't bear the thought of being without me. I was the love of his life, truly." I let out a loud, dry laugh, making her whip around, wide-eyed. "Interesting take, Eleanor." She shot me a glare, ending the call abruptly. "Taylor, this isn't a good time." I couldn't help the smirk on my face. "Oh, I think it's the perfect time. I just got a message from Dad's attorney." Her face drained of color. "And?" I pulled out a printed copy of the email, holding it up for her to see. "Seems he set things up a little differently than you might have thought." Her hand trembled as she took the paper. As she read, her face twisted with a mixture of anger and disbelief. He wouldn't do this. I was his wife, his love. He was afraid of you, Eleanor. Afraid that you'd use him, manipulate him. That's why he protected everything the way he did." I paused, letting it sink in. "So you see, your little fairy tale about being the love of his life wasn't just an exaggeration. It was a lie." She crumpled the paper in her hands, her composure shattering. "You don't understand," she snapped, her voice laced with desperation. I sacrificed so much for him. I was there for him every single day, while you were off living your life. I deserved. You deserved to use him? I retorted, my voice rising. He deserved better than you playing the perfect wife for the public while tearing him down in private. Her eyes narrowed, a glint of rage breaking through her calm exterior. So, what now? You're just going to parade this around, tarnish his memory? No, I replied, my voice cold. I'm going to protect his memory. But I'm also going to make sure that everyone knows the truth about you. Her face paled again, the threat hitting her like a blow. You wouldn't dare. Oh, but I would, I said with a smirk. I'll start with Dad's old friends. Then maybe a few of your salon friends. They deserve to know who you really are. Especially since, as you say, you've sacrificed so much for his memory. For a long moment, she didn't move, didn't speak. And then, for the first time, she looked defeated, her shoulders sagging. Taylor, please, she whispered, her voice trembling. I don't have anyone else. I stared at her, the pity in her voice almost enough to soften me. Almost. But then I remembered the journal, my father's lonely words, his anguish at never being able to please her. I think you should get used to that feeling, Eleanor. With that, I turned and walked out, leaving her alone in that empty house. I didn't care about the money, didn't care about the house. I cared about making sure that my father's story was told the way he would have wanted it, without the lies and the gloss Eleanor had painted over everything. In the weeks that followed, I did exactly as I'd promised. I reached out to my father's old friends, family members who'd known him before Eleanor, even a few of her closer acquaintances. I shared snippets from the journal, letting them in on the man Dad truly was, a quiet, kind soul who'd spent years feeling like he had to be someone else just to keep her happy. Word spread fast. People started talking, piecing together the story behind Eleanor's facade. Her friends and acquaintances pulled away, and her reputation crumbled as whispers spread of her selfishness and cruelty. Eventually, she moved away from the town, leaving that big, empty house behind. The trust Dad had set up gave me just enough to buy a small place in Pittsburgh, where I began my own life anew, carrying with me the lessons his story had taught me. And as the years passed, every time I thought about the life he'd lived and the strength it took to quietly protect himself against her, I felt a strange sense of pride. In the end, Eleanor was left with nothing but the truth, a harsh, unforgiving reminder of the life she'd pretended to lead. And I was left with the memory of my father, not as Eleanor's perfect man, but as a real man who'd loved, struggled, and, in the end, triumphed in his own way.